You are listening to the Information Security Notes and Podcast, episode 31, originally released on October 29th, 2020. As always, I'm your host, Josh Amishav. This week we have Chris Rock on the show to share some tactical tips as a cyber mercenary. My three main takeaways from our conversation were 1. Why 0 days rarely are needed, 2. Why phishing is his go-to technique for the initial compromise, and 3. Why the easiest path to your target may be by hacking someone else altogether, like their accountant. You'll enjoy those two things plus a bunch of other tips along the way. Direct support for this podcast comes from BreachSense, the data breach monitoring platform. Let me ask you, how confident are you that your personal credentials aren't floating around the underground right now? More importantly, how many of you are confident that your employees, your customers, your spouses, or your children's credentials haven't been leaked either? At BreachSense, we use human intelligence to capture stolen credentials before they get leaked to public forums and pay sites. We then crack the hash passwords to give you visibility into whether or not the account needs to be updated. Head on over to breachsense.io/contact to start your free trial and learn how you can prevent account takeover and stop online fraud. Chris Rock, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me.
All right, great. So can you tell us a bit about who you are and what do you do?
Yes, you bet. I'm 47 years old. I'm currently in Melbourne. I moved between Australia and New York. At the moment, I'm running a SIEM company, Security Information Event Management company. I'm the CISO and co-founder of that, based out of New York. And I've been doing hacking, pen testing since I was a young boy, 13, and it's been my career since I entered the workforce. Worked in banks for 12 years, ran a penetration testing company, and an avid researcher as well.
Cool. So you spent some time being a cyber mercenary, which is a bit of a pivot from pen testing or red teaming. How did you get into that?
So it's one of those things where I traditionally went through, with a lot of your listeners did, it may come up in the commercial sector. I worked in banks, as I said, that formal structure and penetration testing, and then I got a call from a friend of a friend, put it that way, who asked me to do an assignment in the Middle East that you would call a cyber mercenary, black ops, whatever you want to call it. It was essentially to retrieve some money that was stolen from a company in the Middle East, and they asked if we could do it, and myself and a small group said, "Yep, we'd love to help," and that was the beginning of that sort of extracurricular work, for a better word.
So what kind of pivot is required to move from pen testing to being a cyber mercenary?
Great question. So obviously, being a good hacker in penetration testing, and defense techniques in that banking sector was a perfect upbringing for me going into this sector, because I knew the defense blue team and I knew the red, and going then from blue red to more, I'd say more scrappy, where there's not that whole 3-week, 4-week, 5-week engagement with a report at the end, limited scope. It's do whatever the hell you can to get the job done, and there's no restrictions on what you can and can't do. I think that's the scrappiness, and then putting all the skills you've learned during your career into the engagement. It makes it a successful cyber mercenary, as in cleaning up after yourself, deleting logs, formatting logs, scrubbing backups, doing the whole thing that you would do if you're on the other side of the fence. That's what we'd be doing in reverse. And also things like planting flags. When you when you're doing penetration testing or you're doing defense, and you're trying to do that forensic component about logs and things that the offenders left behind, we would essentially repeat that process, copy those sort of flags, and then throw them on a compromised host to blame somebody else than us, for example. So there's all those skills put together that then led into that cyber mercenary field.
Okay, that's very cool. So it sounds like the procedures or the methodologies are pretty similar. I mean, you're still running mass scan or whatever, the same tools, and then Metasploit exploits. Do you have to focus a lot more on creating your own 0 days, or are you still able to run off-the-shelf exploits as you would normally do in a pen test?
Again, Josh, another great question. So most of the work that we would do would be off the shelf, custom phishing emails, custom CD-ROMs again sent in the mail, custom pay TV subscription, HDMI stick, stuff like that. So it's not 0 day, not at all. And the only 0 days we would use are if we could do something within, let's say, a 3 week period, because we're on the clock. Like with a normal pen test, you're on the clock anyway for commercial reasons. But sometimes the information we need to retrieve is time dependent. So a 0 day, unless you have them in your back pocket, then we have to get in another way. So I would say the majority of, like as you said, would be probably 99% would be traditional penetration testing tools and methodology. Where it delves into slight differences is we use a lot of on the ground methods. So we would actually use a resource in another country. So if you're targeting, say, a target in, say, Kuwait, for example, we would use on the ground or go in person on the ground to get the lay of the land. I think that the key is having resources on the ground that you can get that local intel out, as in who's the biggest telco, how do they work, how do they operate, what are their subsidiaries, who's the biggest bank. That sort of key ground information we would use from an asset more from the traditional OSINT type techniques. So local knowledge on the ground is key for these exercises.
Now, as a foreigner, though, if you were in Kuwait, wouldn't that be sort of a red flag to raise a lot of questions? Like you would have more difficult time breaking into an ISP than a local would.
No. So obviously on the ground in terms of like physical presence, yes. As in visually, as in doing physical controls, yes. Like you stand out like Dog Paul, someone like me, with red hair and fair skin. But you can use the assets on the ground. In terms of like hacking an actual target, obviously then it comes down to cyber techniques, but so that no in-person required. But you will use local resources for planting things that will blend into the local atmosphere. And if you know the areas such as Middle East, there's a lot of cleaners and a lot of gardeners and a lot of low-paid people doing work that you can use quite effectively to get things inside a home or a business, for example.
So it sounds like you had to use a lot of social engineering, at least for the initial attack. Do you have any stories or any techniques you can share how to use that effectively?
So we had one in Dubai where someone came to me and suspected one of their employees of stealing money from the company, as in moving large invoice amounts from one source to another. And they suspected it but couldn't prove it. So it was a subsidiary, but they didn't have any access to that subsidiary, and they wanted to obtain evidence on that individual. We used a variety of social engineering techniques, which I'll get into, against this individual, but not just that individual, his whole family, professional team, everyone that was in his life. What I mean by that is we would penetrate his doctor, his gym, his family, his accountant, his lawyer, the whole spread of people that surrounded his life, so that when we did form our attack, that we had the inside knowledge of this person intimately. We knew everything this person was going to do, what he would respond to, what's his normal conversation flow, and things like that. So we don't just go and send a phishing email from, his brother or his sister. We penetrate the whole thing. So we would get involved in his life. For example, he was moving house and he was using a courier company. So what we would do is we would then hack into that courier company, send him a fake tracking app for his truck, so that when he moved to his new house, he could actually see the truck moving along the road, and he would install that app. And then at that stage, we had access to his PC because it wasn't doing truck monitoring. It was actually just what we call ET. I think they call them rats now. ET as in their phone's home. So click on something and then it connects it back to us. So that's those sort of techniques we would use, and we would make up on the fly as required for the job.
Now, how much functionality actually needed to work in the fake tracking app? Did the app actually track the truck, or did it just appear to be a broken app?
It seemed like we would have a fake, like a timer button. So it'd be like if the ride was 15 minutes, we would break that trip into 15 minutes. So it would just go ... as the truck moves along its destination. We'd do it enough to fool the individual that the truck, not that they would then get suspected if the truck was 5 minutes late. It's one of those things is, what tech's like. It's like, it was out by 5 minutes, out by 10 minutes, out by 100 meters. Make it enough to be believable, because we still needed access to that individual. We didn't want him to then go, I've been hacked, and then change all his passwords and then be on a level alert that he wasn't in the past.
So if the goal is to attack everyone surrounding your target, what's the process to map out the first, second, and third degree relationships?
It's just like in real life, Josh. So I don't want to assume your life, but I'm assuming, and it may or may not be wrong, but depending on the individual, you're going to have an accountant, you're going to have a lawyer, you're going to have a personal trainer, you're going to have a family structure, a family unit, you're going to have a gym, and you then map out what a normal person does in real life. Forget the tech side, just like what does a normal person do in real life? Who do they meet? Who do they see? And then those peripheral targets will be your first level, because one may fail and you'll need to resort to another. And as I said, these are time specific, so you'll need to have more than one up your sleeve just in case.
Okay, so then again, though, you have the target, you know what city they live in, so presumably their doctor is in the same city, their lawyer probably in the same city, but then to figure out which one it is, though, that seems like quite a lot of work to start going through all the various options to figure out who the right target is.
It is a lot of work. So these are, again, this is differs from the normal pen test where it's 3 weeks. Some of these assignments might be over a 6 month, a year period. Some of these might be over a 3 month period. So those peripheral targets will be depending on the size or time frames that the client actually wants. For example, the one that I spoke about with the individual, with the lawyer, the doctor, that's essentially 4 weeks worth of work compromising those different hosts. You may compromise a family person's email address, or a friend of the person. You'll then get a lot more information from that target. You can use things like in the physical world, you can use like private detectives to follow somebody around and get that sort of key information about back and forth. It's gathering that first. A lot of intel. It is a lot of work, but we're talking about big money here. These are not sort of like $100,000 pen tests or $50,000 pen tests. This might be somebody's defrauded somebody of like say $50 million or $10 million. So you've got room to move and you've got time to get these resources in place.
Okay, cool. Let's talk a bit about the difference between OSINT and CSINT. And I know you're a big fan of closed source intelligence. When do you use OSINT? When do you use CSINT? And I imagine you'd have to start with OSINT to be able to get to the point where CSINT. What's your process like?
Yeah, so OSINT is fantastic. I mean, public information to get what you need, whether it be Google, whether it be directors' reports on a company about shareholdings, whether it be Crunchbase, or that sort of, that what we call OSINT, public information is a great place to start just to map things out. Once we have that sort of things mapped out, we need more accurate information about the person. And to get that, we use closed. So, for example, if I look at the top 100 most rich people in the world, and say for a Forbes 100 list, that'll give me a sense, but it doesn't give me reality. So I need to find out what's the reality of net worth and bank accounts and private bank accounts and Cayman Island accounts versus local accounts. So I'll need the real figure. As in what you tell the IRS versus what you don't tell the IRS. So I'll always start with OSINT first, but to get to know the individual, and there's nothing about knowing the individual than getting access to the local PC, their browser history, their porn history, their friends, their network, their browsing habits, the time they use. That's for us is that next level of compromise. So as I said, start with OSINT, but when you want the real guts of somebody's life, for a better word, closed source intelligence is what we target.
Okay. Now, do you ever target somebody who is, let's say, on the more tech savvy side and has locked down their PC, their networks, and then you're stuck in you're unable to use normal methods in order to penetrate their data?
Yeah, they're the worst type of targets. Someone like, if, for example, bad example, but for example, Josh, if I was targeting you, you're the kind of guy I'm thinking, he's running, 2FA, he's not clicking on any links. The only time he'd click a link on, if it's someone from his family, and it has to be in tune with what his family would normally send him, or a website that he'd normally attend to. You're our worst type. So we will try to bypass you as much as we can. In saying that, if we find using OSINT that you've got a child, that we may target that child PC. We may target that child's school to then get access to the school, then get access to the child's PC, and then that PC comes home with the child. Obviously, knowing you, Josh, I don't know your structure at home. I mean, you're probably running all the alerting tools, all that sort of stuff against all PCs in your network. We have to be really careful about going up against an adversary like yourself, for example. It's a pain in the ass. But most people aren't like that. Most people are idiots. You come up against targets that, even like people in banks or finance institutions, they're all weak. And what I mean by weak is that they're weak targets. So, for example, I go up against somebody on LinkedIn. I've found that they work in a bank. They're in financial control or something like that. You go through the local databases that have been hacked, and you find their name, and they're gamers. They're playing all these types of games. The same username and password they're using in World of Warcraft or all the other nonsense games. They're actually using in the real world with maybe some derivative. So we'll use that information to then penetrate the target. And most of our targets are like that. They're not like you. And like I said at the start of the call, 99% are real easy stuff. It's the real hard stuff in that 1% where it's a 0-day and real out of the box sort of thinking.
Okay, now I was just thinking if you had to go after somebody who is, say, higher up in government, they may have somebody else making sure that there are hardened targets and they're harder to get after, and then it would make your job much more difficult.
Yeah, and what we've done with those situations where it's government departments or prime ministers or that sort of stuff, the telco is the holy grail of our world. So people target banks, they target this, target that. The telco rules the world when it comes to both pen testing and cyber mercenary, because at the telco level, you're not only monitoring the comms between the offender, you're also controlling everything that person uses. So, for example, I'll use Middle East, for example, that's the easiest one. There's 4 main banks. There's a reserve bank and there's subsidiary banks. You'll know that when you own that telco, you'll own maybe 3 or 4 of those banks' internal networking. So you can then have access to all comms. And second to that, all banks, as you know, then sell services, hosting services, security monitoring services. So you then not only get the comms component, you then get the hosting component, whether that be DMZ for internet banking, all that sort of stuff. So the holy grail for us is telcos and in line with telcos ISPs, so we can then control multiple targets all at once. And if you remember from the DEF CON talk I did, we compromised a telco/ISP, and we had access to banks, real estate, government, all in one hand. So going back to your question, in that situation where the target has an advisor and those sort of targets that you'd say are impenetrable, we'll go one layer up and go for the telco.
Cool. Now, I think in your DEF CON example, the telco, I think, was running the sysadmin, the DevOps, the security for the banks. Is that true? Was that specific to Kuwait, or is that, do you find that in other countries as well?
That's everywhere. That's everywhere. So most telcos realize that making money from just telco services is it's not dying, but it's limited in terms of what we call fixed line. So they then go into these sort of extra services. Who better to look after 70,000 routers or firewalls with latest updates than a bank's division to do those upgrades on behalf of the bank as a service. We find that all over the world. You see it with AT&T. In Australia, it'd be Telstra, and in Middle East, it'll be one of those large providers as well. They'll provide these services as well.
Cool. In many realms, you can apply the 80-20 rule. So, for example, for web app defense, if you can stop automation, you can stop 80% of the attacks in the world. What's the comparable 80-20 rule for cyber mercenary activities?
There is none. There is no rule. There's nothing you can do. If you want access, you will get access. Even someone like myself will get penetrated by somebody who learns a little bit about my life, and then will target my vet, for example, and will just lay in wait and then get in through that way. There is no protection for a local person.
So if you're determined, you will get access.
You will get access. Like the lone wolf, you will get access. There is no doubt.
Okay, why do you say the lone wolf as opposed to a team? Is that because a team will eventually make too much noise?
It's the analogy of if somebody wants to kill the president, they can. No one can stop a lone wolf. So the thing in our world and with cyber mercenaries is we are all lone wolves that come together to perform an exercise to make that exercise quicker. We are all still lone wolves, but we will still share intel. A lone wolf will always penetrate a target. So, it might be that each lone wolf is targeting a specific government agency, but collectively they then own the government because it's too much work for one person.
Okay. You recently tweeted that OSINT is overrated. So just to use your Kuwait example, in order to map out the attack surface, i.e. where the various elements that you need to attack are, wouldn't you start with OSINT for that?
Yeah, definitely. So what we do in that case, great example, whether it be on the ground or using remote resources or searching online, we'll actually look at the type of targets we need, whether it be how many banks in the region, how many real estates in the region, how many telcos, how many ISPs. We'll then look at the family structure. Middle East, we're using royal family. So what's the royal family structure? Who's who in the zoo? That can all be traced online. We can use things like the dark web to get information on the targets, such compromised databases. Have they logged into, LinkedIn type passwords, Twitter type passwords, gaming type passwords, that sort of stuff. So we'll gain intelligence that way. We'll look at things like board reports and that sort of information. And then once we've got all that info, we will then, once we have that mapping, we will then use more of that closed source intelligence after that.
Okay, so it sounds pretty similar. Now, how did you make the switch from pretty offensive security to starting a SIM company?
So I've always done both. So it's not like I'm a full-time cyber mercenary and then nothing else. I've always done both. So I'm either a cyber mercenary doing pen testing, or in this case, I was doing offensive work and still doing offensive work and offensive research. It was out of a need for a customer. So just a normal customer that wanted a SIM solution at the time. And we went in as consultants, as a pen testers, and they wanted a SIM. And we got quotes for, I won't name the products, but we got some quotes for some high-priced SIM players, and the customer says, we can't afford that. There's no way we can afford that. Can you build us one? And it's like something that's like, well, we're not software developers, but look, we use a lot of open source tools, whether it be Snort or Suricata or, Zeek, or we use all these tools anyway. So maybe we can look at building you a SIEM solution as a consulting exercise. So we built an open source SIEM solution using Elastic's a back end plus all the open source tools around it to make a SIEM and SOAR and using Shuffle and things like that. And the customer really loved it. And they then asked us whether we would actually release that product to the community just to get a gauge and where we got it right, where we got it wrong. We knew that the product was really strong because it's sort of, when I said to my guys when they built it, I said, I want this tool to run where I work. I don't want to use anything else. I want a one-stop shop for doing monitoring. I want a one-stop shop for doing incident reporting and blah, blah. So it was a chance in a lifetime to create a product from, not scratch, because obviously I'm using, awesome open source products that I would use anyway. But it was a chance in a lifetime to build something that I would use in a defensive, a blue team environment. And we've had customers, and look, I don't want to preach my product, but we've had customers install it, and they've actually, it's a free product, it's free, who've installed it and then detected hackers in their environment. And it's like they had no idea. So for us, it's like, cool, that's what we built it for. If you're going to buy a solution, like a great solution like Splunk's awesome, don't get me wrong, Splunk's great. But all the security admins out there are going to use all the other tools that they've used throughout their career. Like I said, the Suricatas and all that sort of stuff on the side. They're going to use those tools anyway. Why don't we bring it all into one platform? And that's how the SIEM Monster was born.
Cool. So how does a SIEM Monster differ from other SIEM solutions?
What we've tried to do is we've tried to make everything work together. So yeah, you can go get Elastic and install it, and yeah, you can go get Shuffle and install it. Or the Hive, for example. We've actually integrated it so it works as one. So if we find that there's another tool out there that's awesome, let's say there's another tool that's written for a SOAR or CSERT or whatever, we will actually plug that into our product. So we don't care. As long as we get the latest of what's in open source, where someone like you can go, I've never used a SIEM before, I want to have a play, can download it, and you're using all the tools that you should or would want to use to find out what the hell's going on in your environment. That's what we try to do, and we move tools in and out all the time. We're not like we're fixed on this open source module. If there's a better one comes along, it's out, and another one comes in.
Awesome. All right, now what would you say is your secret power?
I'm hyper obsessive. I think the neural diversity is probably the PC word that people use. I obsess over something, and I'm no smarter than anyone else in this world, but I obsess. So if there's something that I want to research on, or for example, building the Steam product, or if I'm doing some research on a DEF CON talk, that's it. I'm gone. That's an 18-hour day, 2, 3, 4 year exercise where I'll just focus in on that topic. I'm doing some research now for a future talk. And it's one of those things I've spent 3 or 4 years on this. I see a lot of people, talk about, I've got a talk at DEF CON and I'm doing my slides a week before it. For me, that's like, man, I've been doing these slides for like 2.5 years. I've got background research. I've got reporting. So I obsess over something and I'll never present unless I know it inside and out. And, to meet the demand of my audience, I don't want to go in half-baked. I'm going to be fully baked. So that's my superpower. It's just obsession, whether it be a target, a victim, or a product research.
A few years back, you gave a DEF CON talk about flaws in the death and birth industries. Essentially, you showed how easy it was to create death and birth certificates that you can use for insurance fraud, for example. Has anything changed since your last talk?
No, nothing's changed in the industry at all. I think on a worldwide scale, no, because what I discovered there was 2 industries colliding together. So we had government policy saying we want babies registered, we want deaths registered. We've got to make it easier for doctors to get this information, because the key thing here is we want data to be able to, to build roads and do forward planning for resources. So we've got to make it easier. And then you've got the hackers on the side who are then, you've got the government going cyber, and then hackers are already there. And then it was just a perfect combination. So there is no backtrack. But you've got doctors who still, I'll give you an example. You've got doctors who, you'll do a death certificate and the government have provided them an online system. But you've got doctors who refuse to use it and will handwrite it, and then they will fax it, and then somebody has to then convert that into and then put it into a digital method. So you're still dealing with that. So to answer your question is no, and nothing's changed.
Wow. Great.
I know, right?
Okay. Yeah, it was a great talk. It's been like 5 years or 6 years now. So
it has. And just going on from that, so that talk alone, I mean, there was obviously multiple years in that talk, but I then spoke to doctors, physically spoke to doctors, spoke to funeral directors, spoke to, sociologists, like what is the effect of this? Just getting to that grassroots, and that goes back to that obsessive personality as I'll learn it inside and out before I present.
Awesome. Well, that's it for today. Thanks, Chris, for coming on the show. If you have feedback or questions, I'm on Twitter at Jamus, Jamusc. And if you got value from this episode, then please share it with a friend. See y'all next week.